The vibration of the deck plates was the only constant in Thane Caro's life. It was a low, rhythmic thrum that traveled up through the soles of his worn boots, vibrating in his shins and settling deep in his molars. It was the heartbeat of the Virex Eternum, the Leviathan flagship of the Zarithi Empire. And for the last 3 years, it had been the sound of his cage. Thane adjusted the grip on his polisher, a heavy humming cylinder of gray metal designed to scour the microscopic dust from the obsidian floors of the Grand Promenade. He was a man of 30 years, though the hard labor and the artificial recycling of the ship's air made him look older. His dark hair was cropped short in the mandatory servant style, and his jaw was covered in the rough stubble allowed only because the Zarithi masters found it amusingly primitive. Under the drab gray jumpsuit of the cleaning cast, his muscles were coiled and tense, a remnant of the soldier he had been before Earth fell. The promenade was a cavernous hallway that stretched for 1/4 of a mile, lined with towering pillars of translucent crystal that pulsed with soft, amber light. Tonight, the air smelled of ozone, exotic spices, and the metallic tang of Zarithi pheromones. It was the night of the Ascension Gala, a political spectacle celebrating the dominance of the Empress and her bloodline. Thane kept his head down. Rule number 1 of survival aboard the Virex Eternum was invisibility. To be seen was to be targeted. To be targeted was to be broken. He moved the polisher in wide, methodical arcs, erasing the faint scuff marks left by the boots of passing guards. The hallway began to fill. The Zarithi were a striking, terrifying species towering over humans with an average height of 7 feet. They were humanoid but predatory, with skin that ranged from alabaster to deep violet, and eyes that lacked pupils, glowing with the internal energy of their psionic lineage. They moved with a liquid grace, their joints articulating with a fluidity that made human movement look jerky and mechanical. Thane focused on the reflection in the black floor. He saw the distorted shapes of high-ranking nobles gliding past. Their robes woven from bioluminescent spider silk and armored weave. He heard the melodic, sharp trill of their language, intercommon laced with the high caste accent that sounded like glass chimes in a windstorm. Then the atmosphere shifted. The casual chatter of the nobles died away, replaced by a respectful, fearful silence. The air pressure seemed to drop, a physical weight pressing against Thane's eardrums. Princess Kalyra Vorn had arrived. Thane did not look up, but he knew it was her. Every servant on the ship knew the specific cadence of her stride, heavy enough to command the deck, light enough to be an assassin's approach. Kalyra was the scourge of the Rim, the executioner of the rebellion, and the most beautiful, dangerous creature in the sector. She walked down the center of the promenade, flanked by 2 members of the Praetorian Guard encased in matte black power armor. Kalyra wore no helmet. Her skin was a pale, icy lavender, flawless and luminescent under the crystal lights. Her hair was a cascade of silver that reached her waist, braided with small adamantine blades that chimed softly as she moved. She wore a gown of deep crimson that left her shoulders bare, revealing the intricate glowing tattoos of her royal lineage. But beneath the silk, Thane could see the rigid lines of a kinetic bodysuit. She was dressed for a party, but she was armored for war. Thane stopped his machine and stepped to the side, pressing his back against a crystal pillar, making himself as small as possible. He fixed his eyes on the floor, counting the seconds until she passed. The ship betrayed him. The Virex Eternum was a masterpiece of engineering, but the sector they were traversing was known for gravitational shear. Without warning, the massive vessel hit a pocket of unstable space-time. The deck plates groaned, a sound like a dying whale, and the artificial gravity flickered for a heartbeat. The floor lurched violently to the left. Thane's magnetic boots lost their lock. The heavy polisher swung wildly, pulling him off balance. He scrambled, his human reflexes firing in desperation, flailing to find purchase on the slick, polished obsidian. He slid across the corridor, unable to stop his momentum. He collided with a wall of crimson silk and hard muscle. Time seemed to freeze. Thane's shoulder slammed into the princess, and his hand, seeking anything to stop his fall, clamped onto the curve of her hip to steady himself. For 1 second, he was intimately entangled with the heir to the Zarethi throne. He felt the heat of her skin through the thin fabric, the terrifying strength in her frame as she barely moved despite his weight crashing into her. His fingers were pressed firmly against the lower curve of her back, just below the waist. The gravity stabilizers kicked back in with a thud. The ship leveled out. Thane scrambled back as if he had touched burning plasma. He crashed to his knees, his breath catching in his throat, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The silence in the promenade was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the air. Every noble, every guard, every servant froze. Kaelira Vorn stood motionless. She slowly turned her head, her movements predatory and precise. Her eyes, glowing with a fierce golden light, bore down on him. There was no fear in her gaze, only a sharp, icy incredulity. She looked at the spot on her dress where he had touched her, then looked at his trembling hand, and finally at his face. Thane waited for the blow. He expected a kinetic blast that would stop his heart, or a blade through the throat. He kept his head bowed, his eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the end. "Don't touch my butt, human," she snapped. The voice was not a scream. It was a cold, clear whip crack that echoed off the crystal pillars. It was imperious, disgusted, and laced with a terrifying calm. Thane's eyes snapped open, shock overriding his fear for a microsecond. He looked up. Kaelira was looming over him, her lips curled in a sneer that displayed her slightly elongated canines. Her hands were on her hips, emphasizing the very anatomy he had offended. I apologize, Your Highness." Thane managed to choke out, his voice raspy. "The gravity, the ship, silence." She cut him off, her voice dropping an octave. She stepped closer, the heel of her armored boot clicking ominously on the floor mere inches from his fingers. "You are filth. You are dust. Do not presume that the instability of the void gives you license to lay your hands on royalty." She looked around at the gathering crowd of nobles, who were watching with a mixture of horror and amusement. Kaelira straightened her spine, regaining her composure instantly. She brushed the spot on her dress as if wiping away mud. "Guard," she said, her tone bored. "Remove this clumsy creature from my sight. His presence ruins the aesthetic of the corridor." One of the Praetorians stepped forward, grabbing Thane by the back of his jumpsuit and hauling him to his feet with bruising force. Thane went limp, knowing that resistance was a death sentence. Kaelira did not look at him again. She turned on her heel, her silver hair whipping through the air, and continued her march toward the gala hall. And someone sanitized that section of the floor. She threw back over her shoulder. "It smells of fear and cheap detergent." The nobles laughed, a tittering, cruel sound, as Thane was dragged away toward the service lifts. He was alive, but as the heavy blast doors of the lower decks closed behind him, blocking out the golden light, he knew the reprieve was likely temporary. In the Zarethi Empire, humiliation was often just the appetizer before the execution. The holding cell in the lower decks was a box of gray steel, 6 feet by 6 feet, illuminated by a single dying strip of blue light. It smelled of stale, recycled water and despair. Thane sat on the narrow bunk, his head in his hands, replaying the moment over and over. He had touched her. He had actually touched the princess. He remembered the texture of the silk. He remembered the density of the muscle beneath it. She was not soft. The propaganda videos showed the royal family as ethereal beings, transcending physical labor. But Kaelira felt like a coiled spring of durasteel. He waited for hours. The ship's chronometer on the wall ticked away the standard cycles. He expected the torturers. He expected the airlock cycling sequence. He tried to compose himself, to find that place of cold detachment he had used during the war when the orbital bombardment shattered the sky above his platoon. When the door finally hissed open, Thane stood up, squaring his shoulders. If he was going to die, he would do it standing. It was not an executioner squad. It was a single figure, a royal steward, a tall, slender Zyrethi male in robes of indigo velvet. The steward looked at Thane with profound distaste, holding a datapad with long, manicured fingers. "Thane Caro," the steward said, the name tasting sour in his mouth. "Yes," Thane said. "You are summoned." Thane blinked. "Summoned? To the brig?" The steward sneered. "To the royal quarters. Princess Kaelira requires your attendance immediately." Thane's stomach dropped. This was it. She wanted to kill him herself. Or perhaps she wanted a live target for combat practice. It was rumored that the royals kept dangerous pets or used prisoners for sport. He nodded slowly, accepting his fate. "Lead the way." The journey up the turbolift was silent. They rose through the strata of the ship, passing the industrial decks, the crew quarters, the officer levels, and finally breaching the spire, the exclusive domain of the highborn. When the lift doors opened, the air changed. It was richer here, oxygenated to a higher purity. The floor was carpeted in a deep, plush material that absorbed sound. The walls were lined with artwork, holographic sculptures of conquered worlds and tapestries woven from starlight. The steward led him to a set of massive double doors made of white wood, carved with the crest of House Vorn, a dragon encircling a star. The steward pressed his palm to the lock, and the doors swung inward silently. "Enter," the steward commanded, staying in the hallway. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not look her in the eye unless commanded. And for the sake of the ancestors, do not touch anything." Thane stepped inside, and the doors closed behind him with a heavy click. The princess's quarters were larger than the entire barracks he shared with 50 other slaves. The far wall was a single massive pane of transparent aluminum, offering a breathtaking view of the star streaks of hyperspace. The room was dimly lit, illuminated mostly by the swirling blue and violet nebula outside and a few floating orbs of warm light drifting near the ceiling. In the center of the room was a low table set with a crystal decanter and 2 glasses. Kaelira stood by the window, her back to him. She had changed out of the gala gown. Now, she wore a long, flowing robe of shimmering silver fabric that seemed to float around her like smoke. It was loosely tied at the waist, looking deceptively casual. Thane stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at a point on the wall just to the left of her shoulder. "You breathe loudly," she said, without turning around. Her voice was softer now, stripped of the performance she had put on in the hallway, but no less commanding. "My apologies, Highness," Thane said. Kaelira turned slowly. Her feet were bare, sinking into the thick carpet. She walked toward the low table and sat down on a plush divan, crossing her legs. The robe fell open slightly at the knee, revealing a long scar running down her shin, a warrior's mark, not a princess's blemish. "Come here," she said. Thane walked forward, stopping 3 paces from the table. "Closer." He took another step. "Pour," she commanded, gesturing to the decanter. Thane reached for the crystal vessel. It was heavy, filled with a viscous, sapphire-colored liquid. His hand trembled slightly, a microscopic tremor, but he clamped down on it with sheer will. He unstopped the decanter and poured the liquid into one of the glasses. The aroma hit him, sweet, intoxicating, like fermented berries and electricity. "And one for yourself," she said. Thane froze, the decanter hovering over the second glass. He looked at her, breaking the steward's rule. Her amber eyes were watching him with an intensity that unnerved him more than her anger had. "Highness, servants are forbidden from consuming royal nectar. The penalty is the loss of the tongue. I am the law on this deck, human," Kalira said, her voice dropping to a purr. "If I command you to drink poison, you drink poison. If I command you to drink wine, you drink wine. Pour." Thane poured the second glass. He set the decanter down and took the glass she indicated. "Sit," she said, pointing to the floor across from her. Thane hesitated, then lowered himself to the carpet, sitting cross-legged. He held the glass with both hands, feeling entirely out of his depth. This was not an execution. This was something stranger. "Why did you not run?" she asked suddenly, picking up her glass and swirling the liquid. "Run, Highness. When the gravity failed, when you fell, most of your kind would have scrambled away like insects before they even made contact. You tried to stabilize yourself. You grabbed me as if I were a bulkhead." She took a sip, her eyes never leaving his face. "You have a soldier's reflexes. I was a soldier before we broke you," she finished, not unkindly, but with a brutal matter-of-factness. "Yes, I read your file while you were in the holding cell. Thane Caro, Sergeant, decorated for valor in the Siege of Mars. You killed 3 Zarithi vanguards in close-quarters combat." Thane stiffened. "I did what I had to do. And now you clean the floors." She leaned forward, the ambient light catching the sharp angles of her cheekbones. "Does it burn you to kneel before the people you once slaughtered?" Thane looked into his wine. The trap was open. If he showed rebellion, he died. If he showed too much submission, she would likely get bored and kill him anyway. He chose the truth. "It burns," Thane said quietly. "Every day." Kalira smiled. It was a small, private thing, lacking the cruelty of her public persona. "Good. A man with no fire is useless. A man with too much fire is dangerous. You are simmering." She extended her leg, the tip of her bare foot brushing against his knee. Thane flinched, spilling a single drop of the blue wine onto his hand. "You touched me today," she said, her voice drifting into a contemplative tone. "In front of the High Council, the Archdukes, and my own mother's spies. You put your dirty human hand on the heir to the infinite throne. It was an accident, Highness. I swear, I know it was an accident." "Thane," she said, saying his name with a strange weight, testing the sound of it on her tongue. "If it had been intentional, you would be a cloud of atoms drifting outside the hull right now. But it was the reaction that interested me. You were terrified, yes, but when I yelled at you, you were not ashamed." She leaned back, studying him like a biological specimen under a microscope. "Most humans weep. They beg. They grovel. You just apologized and waited for the blow. You possess a dignity that is inconvenient for a slave." "I don't want to die, Highness," Thane said, meeting her gaze again. "But I won't beg for my life. I used all my begging up when Mars fell." Kalira stared at him for a long moment. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. The energy in the room had shifted from interrogation to something thicker, something more humid. She was looking at his hands, broad, calloused, scarred from years of war and labor. "Tell me about the rain," she said suddenly. Thane blinked, thrown off balance again. "The rain? Earth. My tutors told me it was a water world. That water fell from the sky uncontrolled. We control our weather. We schedule our precipitation. Tell me what chaotic water smells like." Thane looked past her, out the window at the swirling stars. For a moment, the luxury of the room faded, and he was back in Seattle, standing on a rooftop. "It smells like wet concrete," Thane said softly. "Like dirt and pine needles. It's cold. It soaks through your clothes and makes you shiver, but it washes everything clean. The sound of it, it's like a million tiny fingers tapping on the roof. It puts you to sleep." Kalira watched his face, her expression unreadable. She took another sip of her wine, her eyes slightly hooded. "Chaotic water," she whispered. "It sounds messy and beautiful." She stood up abruptly, the mood breaking like a snapped string. She walked over to him, towering over his seated form. Thane scrambled to stand, not wanting to be looming beneath her. She stepped into his personal space, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She smelled of the wine and something distinct like ozone after a lightning strike. She reached out, her long violet fingers hovering near his face, then tracing the line of his jaw, just above the rough stubble. Her touch was electric, sending a jolt through his nervous system that had nothing to do with fear. "You are dismissed, Thane Caro," she said, her voice low. Thane swallowed hard, his skin burning where she had touched him. "Highness? Go back to your barracks. Go back to your polisher, if anyone asks. I interrogated you regarding security protocols and found you barely adequate." She pulled her hand back, clasping it behind her. Her face hardened again, the mask of the princess sliding back into place. "But do not think you are forgotten," she added. "You intrigue me more than I'd like, Thane Caro." Thane bowed low, his heart racing, and backed out of the room. As the heavy doors clicked shut, separating the scent of ozone and the beautiful, terrifying alien woman from him, he realized he was trembling, not from terror but from an adrenaline spike he hadn't felt since the war. 2 decks above, in the Imperial Observation Suite, the lighting was harsh and white. Empress Varia sat on a throne of fused bone and gold, her presence filling the room like a storm front. She was older than Kalira, her skin a deeper shade of violet, her face etched with the lines of 1,000 hard decisions. Standing before her was Lord Malachar, a political emissary from the outer colonies. He was thin, reptilian in his movements, with cybernetic implants glittering along his cranial ridge. "The girl is erratic, Majesty," Malachar hissed, his voice like dry leaves skittering on stone. "I watched the incident in the promenade. A slave touches her, lays hands on the royal person, and she merely scolds him? In my province, the human would have been flayed on the spot." The Empress looked out at the stars, her expression bored but her eyes sharp. "Kalira has always had eclectic methods. She claims she does not like to waste resources. A dead slave cleans no floors." "It is not about the slave, Majesty." Malachar pressed, stepping closer. "It is about perception. Weakness in the bloodline is a scent that carries. The High Council is already whispering." She summons the creature to her private quarters? Alone? If she cannot maintain the separation between the divine and the dirt, how can she be expected to lead the empire? Empress Varia turned her gaze to Malachar. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Be careful, Malachar," she said softly. "You speak of my daughter, my heir. I speak of the stability of the Zerethi dominion, Malachar countered, bowing his head but keeping his eyes raised. If Kaelira is compromised, if she harbors some perverse curiosity for the lesser species, the succession trials will be bloodier than you anticipate. There are other houses who would see her mercy as a defect. The Empress tapped a finger against the arm of her bone throne. Click, click, click. Watch her, the Empress said finally. Do not interfere, but watch her. If this curiosity becomes a corruption, I will deal with it myself. Malachar smiled, a thin, cruel expression. As you command, Majesty. Back in the bowels of the ship, Thane lay on his narrow cot, staring up at the bottom of the bunk above him. The barracks were filled with the sounds of snoring and the metallic groans of the ship's hull. He held up his hand, looking at it in the dim light. He could still feel the ghost of the silk, the warmth of her skin, and the electric touch of her finger on his jaw. He closed his eyes, listening to the thrum of the engines. The vibration was the same, but for the first time in 3 years, the cage felt different. The door wasn't open, not yet. But for a fleeting second he had seen the person holding the key, and she had looked at him not as a tool, but as a man. And that, Thane realized with a sinking dread, was far more dangerous than any execution. For 2 weeks, Thane Caro became a ghost. He volunteered for the midnight shifts in the reclamation sector, the bowels of the Virex Eternum where the air scrubbers roared loud enough to drown out thoughts and the smell of ozone was replaced by the stench of burning refuse. He kept his head down, his face smeared with grease, hiding in the steam and the noise. He calculated the rotation of the guard patrols to the second, ensuring he was never in the same corridor as a royal steward. He was trying to disappear. He was trying to survive, but the ship was not big enough. The summons came on a Tuesday, during the sleep cycle. His wrist comm, a clunky band of gray plastic fused to his radius bone, vibrated with a sequence that made his teeth ache. It was not the general quarters alarm. It was a direct override code. Thane stared at the blinking red light in the darkness of the barracks. Around him, other humans shifted in their sleep, muttering in exhaustion. He tapped the receiver. Report, a synthetic voice commanded. Royal Deck, Suite Alpha, immediate. Thane closed his eyes and exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding since the gala. He could not run. There was nowhere to run to. When he arrived at the massive white doors 20 minutes later, scrubbed clean and wearing a fresh gray tunic, the same steward from before looked at him with barely concealed loathing. The steward did not speak. He simply pressed his hand to the scanner and let the doors slide open. Kaelira was pacing. She wore a training outfit of tight black ballistic weave that clung to her frame like a second skin, leaving her arms bare. Sweat glistened on her pale lavender shoulders, and her silver hair was tied back in a severe knot. She held a practice blade, a rod of weighted carbon fiber, spinning it idly in her hand. Thane knelt on one knee, eyes on the floor. Your Highness. The lights are wrong, she said. Thane blinked at the carpet. Highness? The ambient lighting in this room, Kaelira said, her voice tight with frustration. It flickers. A micro-fluctuation in the photon emitters. It is distracting me from my meditation. Fix it. Thane looked up slowly. The room was bathed in a steady, warm glow. To his eyes, to any eyes, it was perfect. Highness, I am a sanitation worker. I am not an engineer. You were a soldier, she snapped, stopping her pacing to glare at him. Soldiers fix things in the field. Improvisation. Go. She pointed the practice blade at a panel near the ceiling. Adjust the flow. Thane stood up. He knew what this was. It was nonsense. It was a test, or perhaps just boredom. He walked to the wall, pried off the access panel with his fingernails, and stared at the complex array of Zerethi circuitry. He had no idea what he was looking at. He reached in, found a wire that looked loose, wiggled it, and then tapped the casing. "Is that better?" he asked. Kaelira stared at the lights, which had not changed in the slightest. She tilted her head, the ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "Marginally. You may stand down." She tossed the practice blade onto a velvet couch and walked to the window, looking out at the warp streaks. "My advisors tell me the humans of the Western continent on Earth valued honor above survival. Is that true?" Thane stood awkwardly by the open panel. "Some did. They died first. And you? You survived. I valued effectiveness," Thane said. "Honor is a luxury for people with winning armies." Kaelira turned to look at him. Her eyes were searching, hungry for something she could not articulate. She looked at him not as a servant, but as a puzzle she could not quite solve. She took a step toward him, then stopped, her royal conditioning warring with her curiosity. "You may go," she said abruptly, her voice cold again. "But remain on alert. The air filtration in here also sounds irregular." It became a pattern. Every 2 days, sometimes every day, the summons came. The excuses grew flimsier. She needed him to move a heavy statue that her guards could have lifted with one finger. She needed him to taste a fruit from a newly conquered world because she suspected it was overripe. She needed him to stand in the corner while she practiced her diplomatic speeches because she needed a hostile audience. Thane obeyed. He had no choice. But beneath the obedience, he watched her. He saw the cracks in the marble facade. He saw the way her hands trembled after a meeting with her mother, the Empress. He saw the loneliness that radiated off her like heat. She was the most powerful woman in the sector, and she was starving for something real. And he was the only thing in her orbit that did not lie to her. The routine shattered 10 days later. Thane was polishing the hull plating in Sector 7 when the summons came. This time, it was not to her quarters, it was to the hangar bay. When he arrived, the deck was a hive of activity. A sleek, predatory diplomatic shuttle, the Silver Talon, was being prepped for launch. Steam hissed from coolant lines, and a squad of Praetorian guards stood in formation, their armor polished to a mirror sheen. Kaelira stood at the base of the ramp, arguing with Lord Vexen. Vexen was a cousin to the throne, a male of sharp angles and cruel eyes, wearing the robes of a high inquisitor. "It is a breach of protocol, Kaelira," Vexen hissed, his voice carrying over the whine of the engines. "A diplomatic mission to the moon of Orin requires an elite retinue, not pets." "The Orin are scavengers," Kaelira replied, her voice dripping with disdain. "They respect strength, not ceremony. I am taking a minimal guard to show them I do not fear them, and I am taking a servant to pour my wine because I am royalty, and I will not pour it myself." She turned and saw Thane standing by a crate of supplies. "You get on board." Vexen turned to look at Thane. His eyes were black pits, void of light. He looked from Thane to Kaelira, and a slow, dangerous realization dawned on his face. "The human," Vexen said softly. "The one from the gala." "He is competent," Kaelira said dismissively. "Which is more than I can say for the staff you recommended." "Be careful, cousin," Vexen warned, stepping back. "Obsession is a flaw, and flaws are fatal in our family." Kaelira ignored him and marched up the ramp. Thane, feeling the weight of Vexen's stare burning a hole between his shoulder blades, hurried to follow her. The flight to Orin was tense. The interior of the shuttle was luxurious, but the air was thick with unsaid words. Thane sat in the rear jump seat, strapped in, while Kaelira sat in the command chair, staring at the navigation screens. The two Praetorian guards ignored Thane completely, treating him as luggage. Orin was a moon of jagged rock and thick purple jungles. It was a neutral ground, a place of ancient ruins where the Empire conducted back-channel deals with the criminal syndicates of the Outer Rim. They landed in a clearing surrounded by towering stone arches, remnants of a civilization that had died 1,000 years ago. The air that rushed in when the ramp lowered was hot, humid, and smelled of rotting vegetation and sulfur. "Stay close," Kaelira commanded, adjusting the energy pistol on her hip. She wore a simplified version of her armor today, a breastplate of white ceramic over leather. "If the negotiations go sour, drop the wine and run. I do not want to explain to the quartermaster why I lost a servant." "Understood," Thane said, grabbing the heavy case of supplies. They marched through the jungle for a mile to the meeting point, a crumbling amphitheater overgrown with vines. The Orin delegation was waiting. They were short, multi-limbed creatures with chitinous armor, surrounded by mercenary droids. The negotiation began well enough. Kaelira spoke with imperious grace, demanding tribute and territorial concessions. Thane stood 20 feet back, holding a silver tray, watching the tree line. Something was wrong. The birds had stopped singing. Thane's eyes scanned the dense foliage. He saw a glint of light, not sunlight, but the reflection of a sniper scope. "Ambush!" Thane roared, dropping the tray. He didn't think so. He moved. He launched himself forward just as the jungle erupted in laser fire. A bolt of red plasma scorched the air where Kaelira's head had been a split second before. Thane slammed into her, tackling her to the stone floor of the amphitheater. They rolled together, tangling in limbs and armor, crashing behind a fallen pillar just as the ground where they had stood was chewed up by heavy blaster fire. "How dare you!" Kaelira started to snarl, shock warring with rage. "Sniper, 3 o'clock high!" Thane shouted, pressing her down. The two Praetorian guards were not so lucky. They had been caught in the open. One fell instantly, his helmet smoking. The other returned fire, his wrist cannon screaming, but was overwhelmed by a swarm of mercenary droids pouring from the ruins. "They betrayed us," Kaelira hissed, her eyes glowing with sudden, terrifying power. She shoved Thane off her and rose to a crouch, drawing her pistol. "They will burn for this." "We're flanked," Thane said, scanning the ruins. He saw movement to the left. "We need to move. That pillar won't hold." "I will not retreat," Kaelira snapped. She leaned out and fired, a precise shot that took the head off a charging droid. "You can't conquer them if you're dead." Thane grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. It was a violation of every law in the Empire, but he didn't care. "The temple! Higher ground! Move!" Kaelira looked at him, stunned by the command in his voice. For a second, she wasn't the princess, and he wasn't the slave. They were just two soldiers in the mud. "Go!" she said. They ran. The jungle blurred. Laser bolts hissed through the leaves, vaporizing vines and scorching the stone. They scrambled up a steep, crumbling staircase leading to the main temple complex. Thane moved with a fluidity that surprised her, vaulting over fallen masonry, checking corners, firing a scavenged pistol he had ripped from the dead Praetorian's holster. They breached the inner sanctum of the temple, a massive, roofless hall filled with statues of forgotten gods. Rain began to fall, a sudden tropical deluge that turned the dust to mud. A mercenary dropped from the wall above, a vibro blade screaming. Kaelira spun, but she was a fraction too slow. The blade slashed across her upper arm, slicing through the leather and biting deep into the flesh. She cried out, Stumbling back, the mercenary raised the blade for the killing stroke. Thane did not hesitate. He didn't have a clear shot. He threw the pistol at the mercenary's face, distracting him for a heartbeat, and then dove. He tackled the alien, driving his shoulder into its midsection. They crashed into a puddle of rainwater. Thane fought with the brutal, ugly desperation of an Earth survivor. He used his knees, his elbows, his thumbs. He managed to wrestle the blade away and drove it into the mercenary's throat. The alien gurgled and went still. Thane scrambled up, chest heaving, wiping black blood from his face. He spun around to find Kaelira. She was slumped against a statue, clutching her arm. Silver blood, bright and metallic, was leaking between her fingers, staining her white armor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. Thane dropped the blade and fell to his knees beside her. "Let me see." "Do not touch me," she whispered, but there was no heat in it. She was trembling. "Shut up," Thane said gently. He ripped a strip of fabric from his own tunic. He pried her hand away from the wound. It was deep, but it hadn't hit the artery. "Hold this tight." He bound the wound, his hands working quickly and efficiently. The rain soaked them both, plastering Kaelira's hair to her face, washing away the regal perfection and leaving something raw and real. When he finished, he looked up. She was staring at him. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a stark, terrifying clarity between them. "You saved me," she said. Her voice was baffled. "You could have run. You could have let them kill me and escaped in the chaos." "I told you," Thane said, wiping rain from his eyes. "I don't like people dying when I can stop it. I am your enemy. My mother enslaved your race. You're just a woman bleeding in the rain right now," Thane said. Kaelira's breath hitched. She looked at his face, the stubble, the scars, the fierce intelligence in his dark eyes. The conflict in her was a physical thing, a storm raging behind her golden eyes. She had been raised to believe humans were cattle, yet here was a man who fought like a demon and tended to her with hands that were gentle. She reached out with her uninjured arm. Her hand cupped the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his short hair. She pulled him forward. Thane didn't resist. The kiss was not soft. It was a collision. It tasted of rain, metallic blood, and ozone. It was desperate and angry and hungry. Kaelira kissed him like she was trying to consume him, trying to understand him by tasting his soul. Thane responded with equal force, 3 years of suppressed rage and longing pouring into the moment. His hands found her waist, pulling her flush against him, the hard armor pressing into his chest. For 10 seconds, the galaxy didn't exist. There was no empire, no slavery, no war, just the heat of their bodies in the cold rain. Then Kaelira gasped and shoved him away. She scrambled back, her boots slipping on the wet stone. She looked at him with wide, horrified eyes, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "No. I am Kaelira Vorn." Thane stayed on his knees, breathing hard, his lips tingling. "Kaelira, do not say my name!" she shouted, panic rising in her voice. She struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. She looked at the dead mercenary, then at the bandage on her arm, and finally at Thane. The walls were going back up. He could see them sliding into place, brick by brick. "This never happened," she said, her voice shaking. "Do you hear me? This madness, it is an injury. The shock." "If you say so," Thane said quietly. "I command it to be so." She turned away from him, hugging her injured arm. "The extraction team will be here in 5 minutes, then we will wait in silence, and when we return to the ship, you will return to your duties. As you wish, Highness." Thane watched her back. She stood rigid, staring out into the rain, But he saw her shoulders shaking. She was terrified, not of the assassins, but of him, of herself. The return to the Virex Eternum was a blur of medical teams and debriefings. Kaelira was whisked away to the Royal Infirmary. Thane was dumped back in the barracks, unchecked and unnoticed. He didn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the taste of her still on his lips. He knew something had shifted. The foundation of the world had cracked. 2 days passed. Silence. Then, the summons. Thane walked to her quarters with a heavy heart. He expected execution. He expected memory erasure. When the doors opened, Kaelira was standing by the window again. Her arm was healed, not a scar remaining thanks to Zyrethi dermal regenerators. She was dressed in a high-collared gown of stiff dark blue fabric that looked like armor. She looked impenetrable. "The official report," she began, her voice devoid of emotion, "states that the Praetorian Guard died defending me, and that I neutralized the remaining threats with my psionic abilities. You were merely present." Thane stood by the door. "I understand. You are to speak of this to no one. If a whisper of what happened in that temple leaves your lips, I will have your tongue cut out and fed to the engine beasts." She turned to face him. Her face was a mask of cold disdain. "Do not think this means anything. Thane Caro, it was a biological error, a misfire of synapses under extreme stress. You are still my servant. You are still beneath me." Thane felt a flash of anger. It was hot and sharp. He was tired of the game. He was tired of being a prop in her internal drama. He took a step forward. "Is that why you called me here? To remind me I'm nothing?" "I called you here to ensure your silence," she snapped. "You could have sent a guard to tell me that. You could have sent a droid." Thane took another step. "You called me here because you wanted to see if it was still there. The heat. You forget your place, human." Kaelira's eyes flared with golden light, the air pressure in the room dropping ominously. "My place is cleaning your floors," Thane said, his voice steady, rising to meet hers. "My place is invisible. But you won't let me be invisible, will you? You keep dragging me back here." He stopped 3 feet from her. He didn't bow. He looked her straight in the eye. "If I'm just a servant, send me back to the barracks and leave me alone. Let me rot in peace. But if you're going to keep bringing me here, if you're going to look at me the way you did in that temple, then stop lying." Kaelira looked struck. She opened her mouth to shout, to summon the guards. But the words died in her throat. She looked at his hands, the hands that had bound her wound. "I cannot," she whispered, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "I am the heir. I am the future of the Empire." "Then stop summoning me like I'm your secret," Thane challenged her. "Because secrets are heavy, Kaelira, and eventually you're going to drop it." Kaelira stared at him, her chest heaving. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. She wanted to destroy him. She wanted to pull him into her arms. The two desires were tearing her apart. "Get out," she breathed. Thane nodded. "Good night, Highness." He turned and walked out. This time, he didn't look back. Deep in the bowels of the ship, in a secure data vault that smelled of cold metal, Lord Vexen watched a holographic recording. The image was grainy, recovered from the helmet cam of the dead Praetorian Guard before the feed cut out. It showed the ambush, it showed Kaelira pinned, and it showed the human, Thane Caro, fighting like a berserker, shielding her body with his own. But Vexen wasn't looking at the combat. He was looking at the thermal reading from the drone that had flown over the temple ruins minutes later. It was blurry, obscured by rain, but the heat signatures were unmistakable. Two figures, close together, entangled. Vexen paused the recording. He zoomed in on Kalira's face as she pulled away. He saw the shame. He saw the fear. He smiled, a slow reptilian stretching of his lips. So, Vexen whispered to the empty room, the pristine weapon has a crack, a dirty human crack. He tapped a command into the console. He opened a secure channel to the High Council's shadow network. Prepare the dossier, Vexen commanded, and begin surveillance on the human. Every breath he takes, every word he speaks. The princess has given us the knife to cut her throat. We just need to wait for her to sharpen it. Up in the royal suite, Kalira sat on the edge of her bed. The room was dark. She held her arm, tracing the phantom memory of the wound. She should have killed him. It would have been the smart thing to do. It would have been the Zerithi thing to do. But as she closed her eyes, she didn't see the throne. She didn't see the galaxy she was born to rule. She saw rain. She saw dark eyes full of defiance, and she felt, for the first time in her life, that she wasn't the only person in the universe. She lay back on the silk sheets, staring at the stars, terrified by the realization that she was waiting for the next time she could find an excuse to see him. She was the hunter who had stepped into her own trap. The silence in the royal quarters was not peaceful. It was a held breath. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness of a hull about to breach. Thane Caro stood in the center of the room, the heavy white doors locked behind him. The chronometer on the wall read 3 a.m, ship time. The rest of the Virex Eternum was asleep or cycling down. But here, the lights were dimmed to a low, burning amber, and the air tasted of ozone and agitation. Kalira was not sitting. She was destroying the room, not with a weapon, but with her own restless energy. She paced the length of the suite, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet, her movements sharp and jagged. She wore a sleeping gown of sheer, shifting gray silk that clung to her body like smoke, but there was nothing soft about her demeanor. She looked like a tiger pacing a cage that had suddenly become too small. Thane watched her. He had stopped bowing. He had stopped averting his eyes. The pretense of servant and master had evaporated in the rain on Orin, leaving behind this raw, confused reality that neither of them knew how to navigate. "You are pacing," Thane said, his voice rough with sleep. Kalira stopped and spun toward him. Her hair was loose, a silver cascade that obscured half her face. "I am thinking. Do not mistake royal deliberation for pacing." "You have walked a groove into the floor," Thane noted, crossing his arms. "What do you want, Kalira? It is the middle of the sleep cycle." "I told you not to use my name," she hissed, but the venom was weak. It was a reflex, a shield she picked up out of habit. She marched toward him, stopping only when she was inside his personal space. She smelled of night-blooming jasmine and the sharp, metallic scent of stress. "I cannot sleep. The silence is too loud, and you are the source of the noise in my head." "Me?" Thane let out a short, dry laugh. "I am just the janitor you keep dragging out of bed." "Stop it," she shoved him. It was a physical strike, open-palmed against his chest. It had enough force to stagger him back a step. "Stop pretending to be simple. Stop pretending you are just a body in a gray suit. You saved my life. You held me while I bled. And now you stand there with that infuriating calmness while my entire world is tilting on its axis." Thane steadied himself. The anger in her eyes was not hatred. It was panic. She was a creature of absolute control, and for the first time, she was spinning out. "I am not pretending anything," Thane said, his voice dropping, becoming dangerous. You are the one playing games. You pull me here, push me away, insult me. Then look at me like you want to devour me. Pick a lane, princess. Either execute me or let me go. I cannot let you go, she shouted, the sound echoing off the crystal walls. She lunged at him again, not to strike this time, but to grapple. It was a warrior's instinct. When words fail, use the body. She grabbed the collar of his tunic, twisting the fabric, trying to shake him, trying to provoke a reaction that would make sense of the chaos in her blood. Thane reacted on instinct. He didn't strike back, but he didn't yield. He caught her wrists, his grip iron hard. They collided, a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing. He spun her around, using her momentum against her, pressing her back against the cold surface of the observation window. The impact knocked the breath out of her. Thane pinned her there, his hands locking her wrists against the glass, his body pressing her into the transparent aluminum. The starlight from the void outside framed her silhouette. Her chest heaved against his. Her eyes were wide, pupils blown black, searching his face. The anger vanished, replaced instantly by a terrifying white-hot heat. Thane leaned in, his face inches from hers. He could feel the heat radiating off her skin. He could see the pulse hammering in her throat. The memory of their kiss in the rain rushed back, slamming into them both with the force of a physical blow. "Is this what you want?" Thane whispered, his voice shaking with restrained aggression. "You want to fight? Or do you want something else?" Kaelira stared at his mouth. Her lips parted. She tugged against his grip, not to escape, but to pull him closer. "I want—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. Thane released her wrists and tangled his hands in her hair, tilting her head back. He moved to kiss her, consuming the space between them. Kaelira gasped, her hands clutching his shoulders, her nails digging into the fabric of his tunic. She leaned into him, her body arching, surrendering to the gravity of the moment. Then, a fraction of a second before their lips touched, she froze. She shoved him away with a burst of psionic force that sent him skidding backward across the carpet. Thane caught his balance, chest heaving, staring at her. Kaelira stood against the window, trembling violently. She wrapped her arms around herself, covering her chest, looking at him with a mixture of desire and profound terror. "I cannot," she whispered. The words were a jagged tear in the silence. "Kaelira," Thane said, stepping forward. "Stay back." She held up her hand. Tears shining in silver welled in her eyes. "Do you not understand? I am Vorn. I am the heir. If I do this, if I cross this line, there is no going back. It destroys everything I am supposed to be." She looked at him, and the vulnerability in her expression was more painful than any physical wound. "I want to lose myself in you," she confessed, the admission tearing out of her throat. "And that terrifies me." Thane stood frozen. The honesty of it hit him harder than the psionic blast. She wasn't rejecting him. She was admitting that he was the one thing powerful enough to dismantle her. He straightened his tunic, his heart rate slowly returning to normal. He looked at her with a new kind of understanding. "You don't have to be the heir in this room. Kaelira, you can just be." "I don't know how," she said, turning to look out at the stars. "I was never taught how to just be." The tension did not break. It merely changed frequency. It shifted from a physical confrontation to a cerebral collaboration. 3 nights later, the summons came again. This time, the mood was clinical. Kaelira was sitting at her personal data terminal, a massive curved screen displaying streams of cascading code. "You mentioned you worked in the reclamation sector," she said as Thane entered, not looking up. "You process the scrap data from the core dumps." I shovel the physical drives into the incinerator, Thane corrected, moving to stand beside her. Sometimes I look at them before they melt. Look at this. She pointed to a string of fragmented code glowing red on the screen. I found this buried in the navigation logs of the shuttle we took to Orin. It is an execution command for the ambush. It was not a random attack by mercenaries. The sensor grid on the shuttle was disabled from the inside. Thane leaned in, studying the alien script. He couldn't read Zyrethi fluently, but he recognized patterns. That's signature, he said, pointing to a recurring symbol that looked like a fractured eye. I've seen that before, in the lower decks, on the trash drives from the restricted engineering bay. Kalira looked at him sharply. Are you certain? I remember it because it looked like a glitch. I thought it was a corrupt file. That is the encryption key for the Arch Archive, Kalira said, her voice cold. Access restricted to the High Council. For the next 4 hours, the princess and the janitor worked. It was a violation of every security protocol on the ship. Kalira used her command codes to bypass the firewalls, and Thane used his knowledge of the ship's physical infrastructure to guide her to the redundant backups that the nobles ignored. They were sitting on the floor, shoulders touching, bathed in the blue light of the holograms. The physical attraction was still there, a low hum in the background, but it was superseded by the thrill of the hunt. Got it, Thane said, tapping a sector of the holographic map. There, the date stamp matches the week the war started. Kalira expanded the file. It is unspooled into a video log and a schematic. The image that floated in the air was an artifact. It was a jagged crystalline object, pulsing with a dark, violet energy. It looked ancient and malevolent. The throned catalyst, Kalira whispered, horror dawning on her face. The nursery tales. I thought it was a myth. What is it? Thane asked. It is a terraforming engine, ancient technology. It can destabilize the core of a planet or stabilize it. She swiped her hand, bringing up the text logs. Her eyes scanned the data, widening with every line. The war, she murmured, her voice hollow. The official history states that the Human Federation stole a Zyrethi holy artifact and tried to weaponize it, forcing us to strike Earth in retaliation. That's what they taught us in the re-education camps. Thane said bitterly, that we were the thieves. It is a lie, Kalira said, looking at him. This log, it shows the catalyst was never stolen. It was moving. By High Lord Vexen. He hid it in the nebula and blamed humanity to justify the invasion. He needed a war to consolidate military power for my mother. She sat back, stunned. The foundational truth of her life, that her people were the benevolent conquerors bringing order to a chaotic, thieving species, crumbled into dust. Thane looked at the schematic. They killed billions of us for a lie. Kalira reached out and took his hand. It was an unconscious gesture, seeking an anchor in the storm. They lied to us both. Thane. The revelation shifted the ground beneath them. It was no longer just forbidden lust. It was a shared treason. They were conspirators. The nights that followed became a blur of secret meetings. The pretense of servitude was gone entirely. Thane would arrive, and they would sit for hours, analyzing the data, planning how to extract the full proof without alerting the ship's AI. The intimacy grew in the quiet moments, a hand lingering on a shoulder, a shared look of exhaustion. The way Kalira would lean her head against his arm when the weight of the betrayal became too heavy. They existed in a state of suspended animation. The air between them was thick with unsaid words and restrained touches. There were moments, late at night, when the data streams blurred, that they would turn to each other. The kiss would start, slow and deep, igniting the fire that never truly went out. Thane's hands would map the curves of her body through the silk. Kalira would press herself against him, making soft, desperate sounds. But she always stopped. She would pull away, breathless, eyes full of guilt. She felt like she was using him. She felt that until she could fix the lie of the war, she had no right to the pleasure he offered. She was still the oppressor, and he was still the victim, no matter what the data said. Thane never pushed. He would just hold her until the trembling stopped, frustration warring with patience. But the galaxy does not tolerate secrets forever. The High Council chamber was a circle of cold, obsidian seats suspended over a pit of anti-gravity fog. Empress Varia sat at the head, flanked by her advisors. Lord Vexen stood in the center, his cybernetic eye whirring softly. Kalira stood before them, dressed in her full ceremonial armor, her face a mask of stone. Thane stood 10 paces behind her, flanked by 2 guards. He had been dragged from his shift, still wearing his work jumpsuit. "The accusations are unseemly. Daughter," Empress Varia said, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Lord Vexen presents logs of the human entering your quarters at all hours. He claims you are compromising the dignity of the throne." "I am utilizing a resource," Kalira said coolly. "The human has mechanical skills that exceed the standard droid maintenance protocols. I have him repair the atmospheric scrubbers in the spire." "For 4 hours a night," Vexen sneered. "Does the air in your room require such extensive manual labor?" "My requirements are precise," Kalira retorted, "unlike your sloppy surveillance methods." Vexen stepped closer to Thane. He looked the human up and down with revulsion. "The integrity of the bloodline is paramount. If this creature has touched you, if he has defiled the royal person—" "He has not," Kalira lied, her voice steady as a laser beam. "Then you will have no objection to a precaution," Vexen said, smiling thinly. He gestured to a medical droid hovering nearby. "We will subject the human to amnestic purge, a total memory wipe. We will erase the last 6 months of his neural pathways. If he is just a mechanic, he loses nothing but technical specifications. If he is something else, then we remove the stain." Kalira froze. A memory wipe was brutal. It didn't just erase data, it often shattered the personality. It would turn Thane into a husk. "That is unnecessary," Kalira said, her voice tightening. "He is my property. You do not damage my property." "It is the will of the Council," the Empress stated, looking at Kalira with bored indifference. "The procedure will be carried out tomorrow at noon. Unless you wish to confess to an impropriety that would strip you of your rank." Kalira looked at Thane. He stood stoically, his face betraying nothing, but his eyes were locked on hers. He was ready to take it. He was ready to lose his mind to protect her secret. The choice was a blade in her gut. Admit the affair and lose her power to expose the conspiracy? Or let him be erased and keep her crown? "Do it," Kalira said, her voice devoid of life. "Purge him tomorrow. He means nothing to me." Vexen looked disappointed, but he nodded. "As you command. Take him to the holding cells." As the guards dragged Thane away, he didn't fight, he didn't scream. He just looked at her, and the forgiveness in his eyes broke her heart more than any accusation could. The door to the holding cell melted. It didn't open, it disintegrated. The lock mechanism glowed white-hot and turned to slag under the focus of a high-intensity laser cutter. Thane sat up on his bunk, blinking in the sudden light. Kalira stepped through the smoking ruin of the doorway. She was not wearing armor. She was wearing a heavy cloak. The hood pulled up. Behind her, the hallway was empty, the guards were unconscious and slumped against the walls, victim to a nerve pinch she had executed with surgical precision. "Get up," she whispered. "Kalira?" Thane scrambled to his feet. "What are you doing? The camera's looping," she said. "We have 1 hour before the shift change notices the guards are not reporting in." She grabbed his hand. Her grip was desperate. "Come with me." She didn't lead him to the hangar bay. She didn't lead him to an escape pod. She led him deep into the royal spire, to a section he had never seen. The starlight bathing chamber. It was a room of dark stone and water. A massive pool dominated the center, filled with steaming mineral-rich water that glowed with a faint bioluminescence. The ceiling was open to the void, protected by a force field, allowing the unfiltered light of the nebula to wash over the water. It was the most private, sacred place on the ship. Kalira locked the heavy door behind them. She threw back her hood and let the cloak fall to the floor. Beneath it, she wore nothing but a thin slip of white silk that became translucent in the steam. "Kalira," Thane said, his voice catching. "If they find us here." "They will purge you tomorrow," she said, her voice trembling. She walked toward him, stepping into the water. It lapped at her thighs. "They will take your mind. They will take the memory of me out of your head. They will take the rain." She turned to face him, standing waist-deep in the glowing water. The starlight painted her skin in silver and violet. She looked like a goddess of the void, terrifying and beautiful. "I will not let them take this," she said. "I will not let you die without knowing." "Knowing what?" Thane walked to the edge of the pool. "That I chose you," she whispered. "That for one night. I am not the princess. I am not the heir. I am just the woman you saved." She reached out a wet hand. "Thane, come to me." Thane unzipped his gray jumpsuit. He let it fall to the floor, shedding the uniform of the slave. He stepped into the water. The heat of it was shocking, wrapping around his tired muscles. He waded toward her. The water rose to his chest. He stopped inches from her. The steam swirled around them, isolating them from the rest of the universe. Kalira reached up and touched his face. Her hands were shaking. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I have been trained to kill, to rule, to command. I was never trained to be open." "You don't need training," Thane said softly. He reached out and rested his hands on her waist. Her skin was wet and hot. "Just let go." She made a sound, a small, broken sob, and closed the distance. This time, she didn't stop. She kissed him, and it was a surrender. It was the collapse of a dam. Her lips were soft, urgent, tasting of salt and steam. She wrapped her legs around his waist, pulling him deeper into the water, deeper into her. The act was not a frantic, stolen fumble in the dark. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was an exploration of territories that had been forbidden for centuries. Kalira traced the scars on his chest with her fingers, marveling at the fragility and strength of his human form. Thane worshipped the lines of her alien body, the power in her muscles, the softness that lay beneath the armor. Under the silent watch of the stars, the princess and the slave dismantled the empire between them. It was intense, raw, and overwhelming. Kalira cried out, her voice echoing off the stone walls, a sound of release that had been building for a lifetime. She buried her face in his neck, biting down to stifle the noise, clutching him as if he were the only solid thing in a universe of gas and dust. When it was over, they floated in the warm water, entangled. Kalira rested her head on his shoulder. her silver hair floating around them like a halo. Her breathing was shallow, her heart hammering against his ribs. She lifted her head slowly and looked at him. Her eyes were clear, the golden light softened. She looked devastated, in the way that old things must be devastated to make room for the new. She ran a thumb over his lip. Her hand was trembling. "You touched more than my body tonight," she whispered, her voice laced with awe and terror. "You touched what I tried to kill." "What is that?" Thane asked, stroking her wet hair. "My obedience," she said. She pulled away slightly, the regal strength returning to her spine, but tempered now with a dangerous new resolve. "They want to erase you, Thane," she said, looking at the door. "But they are too late. You are writing to me now, and I will burn this ship to ash before I let them take that away." The betrayal did not come with a scream, but with a whisper that echoed across the entire galaxy. Thane and Kaelira were standing in the grand hall of the Virex Aeternum, summoned for what they believed was a final inquiry before the Council. They had their defense prepared. They had the data regarding the throned catalyst encrypted on a drive hidden in the heel of Thane's boot. They were ready to fight with the truth. But Lord Vexen had decided to fight with theater. A massive holographic projection flickered to life above the council pit, hovering like a guillotine blade. The air in the chamber grew stale as the static cleared, revealing a grainy, distorted image of Kaelira. It was footage from the Starlight bathing chamber, stolen by a hidden sensor Vexen had illegally planted days prior. But the audio was wrong. It had been sliced, rearranged, and warped on the screen. The digital Kaelira looked into the camera, her eyes wide with what looked like panic rather than love. The manipulated voice spoke, disjointed but damning. "I am unfit. The human controls me. I would sell the Empire for his touch. I am weak. I surrender the throne to him." The silence that followed was heavier than a neutron star. Real Kaelira stood in the center of the pit, her face draining of color. It was a masterstroke of assassination. Vexen had not just accused her of lust, he had accused her of treasonous submission. He had painted the fierce, unstoppable air as a puppet dancing on a human's strings. "Lies!" Kaelira roared, her voice cracking with fury. She stepped forward, her hand reaching for the plasma saber at her hip. But the weapon had been confiscated at the door. "This is a fabrication, a digital forgery. The biometric signature is authentic," Vexen said smoothly from his high seat, looking down at her with mock pity. "You admit to being in the chamber with him. You admit to the intimacy. The council merely sees the result, a future empress enslaved by her own base desires for a primitive." Empress Varia stood up. She did not look at her daughter. She looked at the council. "Take her command codes. Strip her armor. Confine her to the spire until the succession can be recalibrated." "Mother!" Kaelira shouted, the betrayal cutting deeper than any blade. "And the human," the Empress added, finally casting a glance at Thane that could have frozen helium. "He is contagious. Liquidate him. Immediately." The room erupted into chaos. Praetorian guards swarmed them. Thane lashed out, breaking the nose of the first guard with a savage elbow strike. But there were too many. He took a heavy stun baton blow to the kidneys that dropped him to his knees, gasping for air. Through the forest of armored legs, he saw them take her. 4 guards held Kaelira down as they ripped the royal signet from her shoulder. She wasn't screaming for mercy. She was screaming threats of war. She looked at Thane, her eyes burning with a desperate, apologetic fire, before a containment hood was shoved over her head and she was dragged toward the high-security turbolifts. "Kaelira!" Thane shouted, struggling to rise, but a boot slammed into the side of his head. Darkness swallowed him. Thane woke to the smell of antiseptic and the cold bite of steel cuffs on his wrists. He was not in a cell. He was in a waste disposal corridor, being dragged by two guards toward the incineration chutes. They weren't even going to give him a trial, they were going to flush him like garbage. His head throbbed with a concussive rhythm. He tested the cuffs. Molecular bonded durasteel. Impossible to break. The guard on the left grunted. "Heavy for a soft skin." "Doesn't matter," the other replied. "He burns the same." They turned a corner into a blind spot near the service elevators. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was slight, quick, and held a silence that screamed of danger. There was a hiss of compressed air, a hypospray discharging. The guard on the right stiffened, his eyes rolling back, and he collapsed silently. The second guard spun around, reaching for his sidearm, but the shadow moved faster, driving a stun shiv into the gap of his armor at the neck. He dropped like a stone. Thane blinked, shaking the dizziness from his vision. Standing over the bodies was Ilara, Kaelira's personal handmaid. She was a small Zerethi female, usually seen carrying robes and pouring wine, terrified of her own reflection. Now, she held a bloody shiv and looked like she was about to vomit. Next to her stood Torian, an older guard with a scarred face who had once nodded at Thane in the mess hall. "Ilara?" Thane rasped. "She knew," Ilara whispered, her hands shaking as she fumbled with a key card to unlock his cuffs. "The princess knew Vexen would move. She made us promise. If they took her, we were to save you." The cuffs clicked open. Thane rubbed his wrists, the feeling returning in painful prickles. "Where is she?" "The spire," Torian said, his voice gravelly. "High security lockdown, null fields, automated turrets. You cannot reach her. Human, not without an army." "I don't need an army," Thane said, his mind racing. "I need a distraction, and I need to get the truth off this ship." He tapped the heel of his boot where the drive still sat. "If I can broadcast the data about the catalyst to the neutral worlds, Vexen loses his leverage. The Empress will have to listen." "The communications array is locked down," Torian warned. "Vexen has jammed all outgoing frequencies to prevent the princess from calling her loyalists." "Not all frequencies," Thane said, a grim smile touching his lips. "The engine decks. The diagnostic buoys use a low-band frequency to talk to the repair drones. It's hardwired. They can't jam it without shutting down the engines." "That is suicide," Ilara gasped. "The engine decks are swarming with Vexen's hunter-killers. They are sweeping the ship for sympathizers." "Then I better move fast," Thane said. He grabbed the stun baton from the fallen guard. "Get to the escape pods, both of you. When the alarm goes off, launch. Get out of here." "What about you?" Ilara asked. "I have a date with the transmitter," Thane said. "Go!" He didn't wait for them to argue. He turned and sprinted into the dark labyrinth of the service corridors. The engine decks of the Virex Eternum were a vision of industrial hell. Here, the sleek crystal and white lights of the upper decks were replaced by groaning pipes, screaming steam vents, and the oppressive red-lit darkness of the reactor core. The heat was physical, a wall of temperature that soaked Thane's jumpsuit in sweat within minutes. He moved like a rat in the walls. He knew these decks. He had scrubbed them. He knew which vents led to the primary conduits and which walkways had loose grating. He dropped from a ventilation shaft onto a narrow catwalk suspended over the coolant abyss. Far below, the reactor core pulsed with a blinding violet light, the heartbeat of the ship. Thane checked the drive in his hand. He needed to reach the tertiary diagnostic terminal on the far side of the catwalk. It was 300 yards of open exposure. He began to run. A screech echoed through the cavernous space. A hunter-seeker drone dropped from the ceiling. its red eye fixing on him. It was a spider-like machine armed with plasma repeaters. Thane slid under a pipe just as the air where his head had been sizzled with superheated energy. He scrambled up, vaulting over a railing, dropping to the lower gantry. "Target located," a mechanical voice boomed over the intercom. "Sector 4, eliminate." Doors hissed open at the far end of the gantry. A squad of Vexen's elite shock troopers poured out, their heavy boots clanging on the metal. Thane was trapped. Drone above, soldiers ahead, reactor below. He didn't stop. He ran straight at the soldiers. "Fire!" the squad leader commanded. Thane threw the stun baton. It wasn't a weapon. It was a distraction. It hit a steam pressure valve on the wall next to the soldiers. The valve ruptured with a deafening roar, blasting a jet of scalding steam across the walkway. The soldiers screamed, blinded and burned, their formation breaking. Thane dove through the steam cloud, choking on the heat. He tackled the lead soldier, using the Zyrethi's armored body as a shield as the drone fired again. The plasma bolt hit the soldier's breastplate, knocking them both down. Thane rolled, coming up with the soldier's rifle. He fired 3 precise shots. The drone exploded in a shower of sparks and debris. He scrambled toward the terminal. He jammed the drive into the port. "Upload," he screamed at the screen. "Come on!" Access denied. Security override active. Thane slammed his fist against the console. Vexen had anticipated this. The low-band frequency was open but encrypted with a royal cipher. "Thane!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. It boomed over the ship's address system. It was Vexen. "A valiant effort," Vexen's voice sneered. "But you are a janitor trying to play chess with a grandmaster. Yeah, look up." Thane looked up. Suspended on a gravity lift platform descending from the upper levels was Vexen himself, surrounded by a phalanx of heavy guard droids. And beside him, bound in energy shackles that glowed with agonizing light, was Kaelira. She looked broken. Her armor was gone, replaced by a prisoner's gray rags. Her face was bruised, her lips split, but her eyes were locked on Thane, terrified. "Let her go!" Thane shouted, raising the rifle. "Surrender the drive," Vexen commanded, "and I will grant you a quick death. Refuse, and I will make you watch while I dismantle her mind piece by piece." Thane hesitated. The upload was blocked. He was outgunned. If he fought, she died. He slowly lowered the rifle. He pulled the drive from the terminal. "Smart animal," Vexen purred. The platform lowered to the catwalk. The shock troopers surrounded Thane, ripping the weapon from his hands and forcing him to his knees. Vexen stepped off the platform, dragging Kaelira by her shackles. He stopped in front of Thane, holding out his hand. "Give it to me." Thane placed the drive in Vexen's palm. Vexen crushed it. The plastic shattered, the chip inside grinding to dust between his cybernetic fingers. The proof was gone. "Now," Vexen said, drawing a jagged ceremonial dagger from his belt. "The cleanup." He looked at Kaelira. "Watch, princess. Watch the end of your little rebellion." Vexen raised the dagger, aiming for Thane's throat. Kaelira's head snapped up. She looked at the reactor core pulsing below them. She looked at the energy shackles binding her wrists. "You forgot one thing. Vexen," Kaelira whispered. Her voice was raspy, but clear. Vexen paused, the knife inches from Thane's skin. "And what is that?" "You stripped my armor," she said, a dangerous smile touching her bloody lips. "You took my command codes, but you forgot that I am a daughter of the void." She didn't pull against the shackles. She pushed into them. She closed her eyes and screamed, a sound of pure psychic rage. She channeled every ounce of her latent psionic energy not outward, but inward, into the energy field of the cuffs. It was a feedback loop, a suicide maneuver. The cuffs shrieked. The energy field is overloaded. Boom! The explosion blew the shackles apart, sending a shockwave of violet force outward. It knocked Vexen backward, sending the dagger skittering across the deck. The shock troopers were thrown off their feet. Kaelira stood free, her hands burning and smoking, but free. She didn't run. She moved with the blur of a combat stimulant. She grabbed the nearest trooper, ripped the helmet off, and slammed his head into the railing. She snatched his rifle, spun, and fired a suppression volley at the droids hovering near Vexen. "Thane, move!" she screamed. Thane was already moving. He grabbed Vexen by his robes and threw him into the path of a recovering droid, buying them a second. He sprinted to Kaelira. "The hangar is too far," Thane yelled over the chaos. "Not the main hangar," Kaelira shouted, firing blindly behind them as they ran along the catwalk. "The prototype bay, it's just below the core." They leaped. It was a 20-foot drop to the lower maintenance deck. They landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Thane felt something snap in his ribcage, a sharp, hot pain, but adrenaline masked it. They sprinted through the maze of pipes, bursting into a small, secure bay. Sitting there was a sleek black needle of a ship, an experimental stealth interceptor. "Can you fly this?" Thane asked, slapping the door controls to seal the bay behind them. "I can fly a rock if it has thrusters," Kaelira snarled. She tapped a keypad on the wall. "Override Vorn Alpha 1. The canopy hissed open. They scrambled into the cockpit. It was tight, designed for a single pilot. Kaelira jumped into the pilot's seat, her fingers flying across the controls. Thane jammed himself into the small space behind her, his legs straddling the seat, his arms bracing against the canopy. "Hold on," Kaelira warned. "This is going to be violent." The bay doors began to open, revealing the swirling blue vortex of hyperspace outside the flagship's shields. "They're locking on," Thane shouted, watching the sensor scope. "Missile lock." "Let them try," Kaelira said. She slammed the throttle forward. The interceptor screamed. The G-force hit them like a hammer. They shot out of the bay, a black streak against the stars. Red warning lights flooded the cockpit. Flak bursts exploded around them, shaking the small ship violently. A laser bolt clipped their starboard wing, sending a shower of sparks into the cabin. "Shields are down," Kaelira yelled. "We took a hit to the fuel stabilizer." "There's a moon," Thane pointed at the nav screen, a desolate gray sphere looming in the distance. "Sector 9, it's uninhabited, heavy magnetic interference. They can't track us through the storms. If we go into that storm with a damaged stabilizer, we crash," Kaelira said, wrestling the stick. "If we stay here, we vaporize," Thane countered. Kaelira looked at the sensors. 3 Vexen destroyers were turning to engage. She looked at the moon. "Brace yourself, human," she said. She rolled the ship and dove straight into the atmosphere of the moon. The world turned into fire and turbulence. The ship shook so hard Thane thought his teeth would shatter. The sky outside went from black to a swirling, luminous violet as they hit the magnetic storms. Lightning, thick as tree trunks, lashed at the hull. "I can't hold the nose up," Kaelira gritted out, fighting the controls with both hands. "Gliding angle," Thane shouted, reaching over her shoulder to adjust the flap hydraulics manually. "Cut the engines. Let gravity take us." "Cutting engines!" The scream of the thrusters died, replaced by the roar of the wind. They plummeted through the clouds, the ground rushing up to meet them, a landscape of jagged rock and glowing crystal formations. "Pull up!" Thane roared. Kaelira hauled back on the stick. The ship leveled out, its belly scraping across a ridge of stone with a deafening screech of tearing metal. They skipped once, twice, shearing off a wing, and then slammed into a dune of gray sand, sliding for hundreds of yards before coming to a grinding, smoking halt. Silence. Thane unbuckled his harness, coughing in the acrid smoke filling the cockpit. Kalyra? She didn't answer. She was slumped over the console. Kalyra! He scrambled over the seat, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He grabbed her shoulders and pulled her back. She groaned, her eyes fluttering open. There was a gash on her forehead, blood streaming down her face, mixing with the soot. Status? She mumbled, her eyes unfocused. Alive, Thane said, popping the manual release on the canopy. It blew off with a hiss. We have to move. The fuel cells might rupture. He dragged her out of the wreckage. They stumbled away from the ship, boots sinking into the gray sand, the wind howling around them. They made it to the shelter of a small cave, a hollow in a massive crystal formation, just as the ship's reactor vented, sending a plume of blue fire into the sky. They collapsed against the rock wall, gasping for air. Outside, the storm raged. It was beautiful and terrifying. The clouds glowed with bioluminescent spores, casting an eerie, shifting light over the barren landscape. The lightning was silent, flashing in rhythmic pulses. Thane checked Kalyra. She was shivering, shock setting in. He pulled a survival pack from his belt, the only thing he had managed to grab. He ripped open a med kit. Let me see the head, he said gently. Kalyra leaned back, letting him wipe the blood away. She hissed as he applied a stinging antiseptic gel. Careful, she murmured. That is royal skin you are scrubbing. Thane stopped. He looked at her. She was dirty, bleeding, her clothes torn, stripped of every title and every weapon, and she was joking. You almost died, Thane said, his voice thick. You blew up your own restraints. You flew into a magnetic storm. I told you, she said, her eyes finding him. I am not obedient anymore. Thane finished bandaging her head. He checked her arms and ribs. His hands were efficient, but they lingered. He was touching her not as a servant, but as a man checking to make sure his world was still intact. You're hurt too, she said, noticing the way he favored his left side. Just a rib. I've had worse. She reached out and touched his chest, her hand resting over his heart. You came back for me, in the engine room. You gave up the drive, the only proof we had. The drive was plastic and silicone, Thane said. You are... He stopped, searching for the word. A problem, she suggested, a weak smile tugging at her lips. Everything, he finished. You are everything? Kalyra stared at him. The adrenaline of the crash was fading, replaced by something far more potent. The reality of their survival crashed into them. They were alone on a dead rock at the edge of the universe. No council, no empress, no rules. She looked at his hands, hands that had cleaned floors, fired rifles, and held her together. You are looking at me again, she whispered. I can't help it. She winced in pain as she shifted, but she didn't pull away. She leaned forward, her forehead resting against his. Do you remember the gala, when I told you not to touch me? Hard to forget. Kalyra let out a breathy laugh that turned into a groan of pain. She looked down at her torn clothes, then up at him, her eyes dark with intent. Now you can touch whatever you like. Human. Thane didn't wait. He kissed her. It wasn't the angry kiss of the rain, or the desperate kiss of the bathhouse. It was a claim. It was a collision of two survivors who needed to feel life to prove they hadn't lost it. He pulled her into him, careful of her injuries but unable to be gentle with his needs. Kalyra responded with a fierce urgency, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him down. They fumbled with the latches of their ruined clothes, stripping away the layers of armor and uniform until there was nothing left but skin and heat. The storm outside was a mirror of the one inside the cave. The luminous lightning flashed, illuminating their bodies in strobes of violet and white. They made love with a desperation that bordered on violence, a frantic affirmation of existence. Kaelira, the princess who had never been allowed to choose, chose him with every touch, every arch of her back, every sound she made against his skin. Thane, the slave who had been invisible, was suddenly the only thing in the universe she could see. There was vulnerability in the way she clung to him, whispering his name like a prayer. There was worship in the way he held her, as if she were more fragile than the crystal walls around them. When the crest came, it was a shared shattering. They lay together in the aftermath, limbs entangled, covered in sweat and dust, breathing the same air. Kaelira rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. It was steady. It was real. "We have nothing," she whispered into the darkness. "No ship, no proof, no army." Thane wrapped his arm around her, pulling the survival blanket over them both. He looked out at the glowing storm. "We have tomorrow," he said, "and for the first time, it belongs to us." Kaelira closed her eyes, her hand resting on his stomach. "Tomorrow," she agreed, "but tonight, don't let go." "Never," Thane promised, and under the watch of the alien storm, the exile began. The gray dust of the moon coated everything. It settled in the creases of their ruined clothes, matted their hair, and tasted like metallic ash. For 3 days, Thane Caro and Princess Kaelira Vorn existed on the edge of survival, sheltered within a crystalline cave that hummed with the magnetic resonance of the storm raging outside. They were no longer the servant and the master. They were scavengers. Thane sat near the entrance of the cave, stripping wires from a panel they had ripped from the wreckage of the interceptor. His hands were raw, the knuckles split, but his movements were precise. Kaelira sat opposite him, sharpening a piece of jagged scrap metal against a rock. She wore a tunic fashioned from the thermal lining of the pilot's seat, her royal finery long gone. She stopped her work and looked at him. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared solitude that felt heavier and more real than the crowded decks of the flagship. "I never knew silence had a sound," Kaelira said softly. Thane looked up. "On Earth, we called it peace. But out here, I think it is just the universe holding its breath." "I was never allowed silence," she confessed, looking out at the violet lightning flashing silently across the desolate horizon. "From the moment I was born, there was noise, tutors reciting laws, generals shouting strategies, the council whispering threats. I was a vessel, Thane. They poured expectations into me until there was no room left for a soul." Thane set the wires down. He saw the vulnerability she usually hid behind armor. "You are not a vessel, Kaelira. You are the fire that burns the vessel down." She smiled, a sad, fleeting expression. "They told me that choice was a weakness. They said a queen does not choose. She accepts her burden. I was betrothed to a warlord from the Outer Rim before I could speak. I was trained to kill before I learned to read poetry. I never chose my clothes, my food, my friends. Even my cruelty was scripted." She crawled over the dusty ground until she was sitting beside him, her shoulder pressing against his. "That is why I hated you at first. You were a slave, yet you had a defiance in your eyes that I envied. You chose to survive. You chose to keep your dignity. I had galaxies at my feet, but I felt smaller than you." Thane reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers interlacing with her long, pale ones. "You have a choice now. We fix this relay. We send the encryption keys and we change everything. Or we stay here, eat ration bars, and watch the storms until the air runs out. I choose the first one, she said, her grip tightening. But only because the ration bars taste like chalk. They worked through the night cycle. The moon, which Kalira identified as Xylos, was a graveyard of magnetic interference, which meant their signal had to be strong and directional. They cannibalized the interceptor's sublight comms array, wiring it to the power core of the ejection seat. It was a jury-rigged abomination of technology, a tangle of wires and desperation. But when Thane connected the final coupling, the console flickered to life. "It is ready," Thane said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We have one shot. The power cell will burn out after a single burst transmission." Kalira nodded. She closed her eyes, summoning the sequence of numbers and symbols she had memorized from the hidden archive, the encryption keys that would unlock the proof of Vexen's treachery for every neutral system to see. She didn't need the physical drive. Vexen had forgotten that a Xerithi royal was trained to memorize star charts and battle plans. She was the driver. She began to recite the code, her fingers flying across the salvaged keypad. Broadcasting on all open frequencies. Priority override. Vorn absolute. The dish outside the cave swiveled, whining in protest against the wind. A beam of concentrated data shot up through the storm, punching a hole in the magnetic interference and racing toward the nearest relay buoy. The console sparked and died. Smoke curled from the casing. "Did it go?" Kalira asked, breathless. "It went," Thane said. "The truth is out there, faster than light." Kalira leaned back against the rock wall, exhaling a long breath. "Now Vexen knows exactly where we are. That signal was a flare." "Let them come," Thane said, checking the charge on the plasma rifle he had scavenged. "I'm tired of running." They didn't have to wait long. 6 hours later, the sky tore open. A ship descended through the clouds. Not a royal cruiser, but a sleek, ugly vessel painted in the matte black and blood-red colors of the Bounty Guild. Vexen had not sent the military. He had sent mercenaries to clean up his mess quietly. The ship, a heavy assault transport, slammed down on the flat plain 300 yards from their cave. The ramp lowered, and a squad of 4 armored figures emerged. They were huge, non-humanoid species with multiple arms and heavy cannons. "Stay low," Thane commanded, slipping into the soldier mindset. "They will sweep the crash site first." "I am done staying low," Kalira said. She stood up, grabbing the jagged metal shard she had sharpened. It was a crude sword, but in her hands, it looked lethal. "They are on my moon. They are hunting my consort. They will bleed." Thane looked at her. She called him consort. Not a servant, not human. Consort. He grinned, a feral expression. "Right, flanking maneuver. I'll draw their fire. You take the heavy on the left." They moved as one. Thane broke cover, sprinting toward a ridge of crystal formations. He fired the plasma rifle, a bright blue bolt striking the lead mercenary in the chest plate. The alien roared, its shield flaring, and returned fire with a rotary cannon that chewed up the ground at Thane's heels. "Over here, you ugly bastards!" Thane shouted, diving behind a rock. The mercenaries turned their attention to him, their weapons focusing on his position. It was exactly what Kalira needed. She moved like a phantom. Without her armor, she was faster, lighter. She used the terrain, leaping from rock to rock, closing the distance before they realized she was there. She didn't just use the metal blade, she used her mind. She reached out with a telekinetic lash, grabbing a loose boulder and hurling it at the second mercenary. The rock slammed into the alien's helmet with a sickening crunch. The heavy weapons specialist turned, spotting her. He raised his cannon. Kalira didn't dodge. She slid on her knees across the gravel, ducking under the plasma stream, and drove the metal shard upward into the gap of the mercenary's armor. Psionic energy flowed through her hands, into the metal, turning the crude blade into a vibrating cutter that sheared through the alien's internal organs. Thane popped up from his cover. He took careful aim and shot the third mercenary through the eye slit. The leader, the one Thane had hit first, was still standing. He charged Kalyra, a vibroaxe in one hand. Kalyra was weaponless, her blade stuck in the fallen enemy. "Kalyra!" Thane shouted, scrambling to get a clear shot, but they were too close. Kalyra didn't flinch. She waited until the axe was descending, then stepped inside the guard. She grabbed the mercenary's wrist with both hands. Her eyes glowed with blinding golden light. "Kneel!" she commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a psychic hammer blow. The mercenary stiffened, his nervous system overwhelmed by the sheer force of her will. He dropped to his knees, dropping the axe. Kalyra spun and delivered a roundhouse kick to his helmet, shattering the faceplate. The mercenary collapsed. Silence returned to the gray plain. Thane ran to her. She was breathing hard, dust and alien blood on her face, but she was unhurt. "You," Thane said, breathless, "are terrifying." "I am Zyrethi," she said, wiping her hands on her tunic. "Now, let us see if their ship has a working hyperdrive. I have an appointment with my mother." The Virex Eternum was bleeding. It was not physical damage, but a wound in the order of things. The data Kalyra had released had spread like a virus across the fleet. The truth about the catalyst, the manufactured war, the lies of Vexen it was playing on every public screen, every datapad, every terminal. Chaos reigned in the corridors. Loyalists were shouting at reformists. Guards were unsure who to obey. The grand machine of the Empire was grinding to a halt. Into this chaos, the stolen bounty hunter ship drifted. It bypassed the perimeter patrols, broadcasting an old high-level clearance code that hadn't been used in 20 years, the personal override of the Empress's father. They docked in the private royal hangar. No one was there to stop them. The guards had abandoned their posts, drawn to the riots on the promenade. Kalyra and Thane walked down the ramp. They looked like wraiths. Kalyra in her scavenger rags, holding the mercenary's vibroaxe. Thane in his torn flight suit, carrying the plasma rifle. "Ready?" Thane asked, checking the charge on his weapon. "No," Kalyra said, "but I am doing it anyway." They marched through the ship. They didn't sneak. They walked down the center of the main corridors. Soldiers saw them and froze. Some raised weapons, then lowered them, seeing the look on the princess's face, and others bowed, uncertainly. "Make way!" Thane shouted, his voice booming. "Make way for the air!" It was a strange reversal, the human clearing the path for the alien queen. They reached the heavy gold doors of the council chamber. The Praetorian guards stationed there crossed their halberds to bar the way. "Step aside," Kalyra said calmly, "or I will stain these floors with your blood, and I will not bother to have them cleaned." The guards looked at each other. They looked at the axe in her hand. They stepped aside. Kalyra pushed the doors open. The chamber was in an uproar. The council members were shouting over each other. Empress Varia sat on her bone throne, looking aged and diminished. Lord Vexen was standing in the center of the pit, trying to shout down a hologram of a rebellious admiral. The doors slammed shut behind Kalyra and Thane. The sound cut through the noise like a gunshot. Every head turned. Kalyra walked down the steps into the pit. Thane walked beside her, his rifle held low but ready. "You are alive," Empress Varia said. Her voice was not angry. It was filled with a strange, exhausted wonder. "Disappointing, isn't it?" Kalyra said. She stopped 10 paces from Vexen. Vexen's face twisted. Guards, kill them, they are traitors, they are escaped prisoners. Silence, Vexen, Kaelira snapped. The authority in her voice was absolute. It wasn't the petulant demand of a princess, it was the command of a ruler. Your lies are burning across the galaxy. The catalyst is not a myth. You hid it. You used it to frame humanity. You started a genocide to secure your own seat at the table. It was for the Empire, Vexen shrieked, losing his composure. To make us strong, to unite us against a common enemy. You made us murderers, Kaelira said, and you made us liars. She threw the vibro-axe down. It clattered loudly on the obsidian floor. I challenge you, Kaelira said. By the right of blood, you claim I am unfit. You claim I am weak because I lay with a human. Come then, prove your strength. Vexen looked at the axe, then at Kaelira. He was a politician, not a warrior, but he was cornered. He drew his ceremonial dagger, the same one he had held to Thane's throat. You are a disgrace, Vexen hissed. You are polluted. He lunged. It was over in seconds. Kaelira didn't use a weapon. She didn't use psionics. She used the move Thane had taught her during a sparring session in her quarters, a simple, brutal disarm. She caught Vexen's wrist, twisted it until the bone snapped, and drove her elbow into his throat. Vexen collapsed, gasping, clutching his crushed windpipe. Kaelira stood over him. She looked up at the council. She looked at her mother. The war is over, Kaelira announced. Recall the fleets. Release the prisoners. We are done conquering. The Empress stood up slowly. She descended the stairs of the dais. She looked at Vexen writhing on the floor, then at Kaelira. Finally, her gaze landed on Thane. You survived, the Empress said to him. I had a good reason to, Thane replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. The Empress looked back to her daughter. You have exposed the rot, Kaelira. You have proven your strength. The council is broken. The people are confused. They need a strong hand. They need an empress. She gestured to the empty spot on the dais next to the throne. Take your place, the Empress offered. Vexen will be executed. The human. He can be your consort. Officially. We will change the laws. Just take the crown and restore order. The room held its breath. It was everything Kaelira had been raised to want. Absolute power. Validation. Her mother's approval. And she could keep Thane. Kaelira looked at the throne. It was beautiful. It was high above the rest of the room. It was lonely. Then she looked at Thane. He was dirty, bruised, standing in the middle of a hostile room with a rifle in his hand, ready to die for her. He wasn't looking at the throne. He was looking at her. Kaelira reached out and took Thane's hand. No, she said. The Empress blinked. No? I do not want the chair, Kaelira said. I do not want the silence of that high room. I do not want to spend my life wondering which of my advisors is plotting to kill me. You are the heir, the Empress insisted, her voice rising. You were bred for this. You were raised to conquer galaxies. Kaelira smiled. It was the genuine, warm smile she had found in the cave on the moon. I was raised to conquer galaxies, she agreed. She squeezed Thane's hand, and he squeezed back, an anchor in the storm. But I would rather build one with him. She turned her back on the throne. We are leaving, Kaelira said. We are taking a ship. We are going to the neutral zone. Do not follow us. Do not look for us. If you need advice on how to govern without tyranny, send a transmission. Otherwise, leave us alone. You cannot just walk away, the Empress shouted. You are royal. I am Kaelira, she said. She tugged on Thane's hand. Come on, human. Let's go touch some buttons we aren't supposed to. Thane laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. "After you, princess." They walked out of the council chamber. The guards parted like the sea. The nobles stared in stunned silence. They walked through the corridors of the flagship, past the shocked crew, past the memories of the cleaning shifts and the stolen glances. They walked into the hangar bay, boarded the fastest long-range scout ship, and powered up the engines as the ship blasted out of the docking bay, leaving the Virex Eternum behind. Thane looked at the navigation console. "Where to?" he asked. Kaelira looked at the star map. It was full of open space. "Anywhere," she said. "As long as it rains." Thane punched in the coordinates. The stars stretched into lines of light, and for the first time in the history of the Zarithi Empire, a princess and a slave disappeared into the void, not as fugitives, but as pioneers of a new kind of life. The silence of space was no longer a cage. It was a canvas. The planet was named Sanctuary by the refugees, but on the star charts, it was merely Sector 7 Delta, a lush, untamed world orbiting a pair of yellow-orange suns. It was a world of aggressive greens and vibrant, impossible blues, where the gravity was slightly lighter than Earth standard and the air smelled of wet loam and crushed spices. Thane Caro wiped a smear of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. He was standing knee-deep in a muddy irrigation trench, wrenching a bolt on a hydroponic pump he had scavenged from the wreckage of a downed smuggler's transport. The pump groaned, sputtered, and then began to hum with a steady rhythmic beat, drawing water from the river to the terraced fields above. He straightened up, his back cracking audibly. He was shirtless, his skin bronzed by the twin suns, new scars from the crash on the moon fading into white lines against the old scars of his servitude. He looked out over the settlement. It was a chaotic, beautiful sprawl of structures. There were domes made of fused silica, traditional Zarethi yurts woven from high tensile fabric, and sturdy wooden cabins built by human hands. It was not a city. It was a living organism, growing and adapting daily. 6 months had passed since they had walked out of the council chamber. 6 months since they had stolen a ship and vanished into the void. Thane watched a group of workers moving crates of harvested tuber roots near the landing pad. They were a mix of species, humans, Zarithi defectors, and other alien races that had been crushed under the Empire's boot. They worked side by side, arguing in 3 different languages, but laughing. "It holds," a voice called out. Thane turned. Kaelira was standing on the ridge above the trench. She was no longer wearing the silk of a princess or the rags of a survivor. She wore practical trousers of rough-spun cloth and a tunic of deep indigo, her silver hair braided back tightly against her scalp. She looked fierce, healthy, and entirely at home in the mud. "The seal was cracked," Thane said, climbing out of the trench. "I had to bypass the regulator. It won't win any engineering awards, but it will water the crops." Kaelira handed him a canteen of water. "Function over form. A lesson I am slowly learning." She looked down at the settlement, her golden eyes scanning the perimeter with the practiced gaze of a commander. "The perimeter sensors are picking up atmospheric turbulence. A storm is coming in from the Eastern Ocean. We need to secure the solar arrays." "I'll handle it," Thane said, taking a long drink. "How was the morning session?" Kaelira smiled, a genuine expression that softened the sharp angles of her face. "Challenging. The human children are aggressive, and the Zarethi children are arrogant. I spent the first hour breaking up 3 fistfights, but by the end, they were practicing the blocking drills together. I told them that if they want to kill each other, they must first learn how to stop someone from killing them." "Diplomacy through defense," Thane mused. It is the only language the galaxy truly respects, she replied. She reached out and brushed a speck of dirt from his cheek. The touch was casual, possessing an intimacy that didn't need words. In the palace, such a gesture would have been a capital offense. Here, it was just Tuesday. Come, she said. The Council of Elders is meeting at midday. They want to discuss the grain distribution, and I believe they are terrified I will invoke a royal decree if they disagree with me. Thane laughed, grabbing his tool belt. Old habits die hard, Highness. Do not call me that, she warned, though her eyes danced with amusement. Or I will assign you to latrine duty. I'm the head engineer, Thane retorted, falling into step beside her. I assign the latrine duty. The peace of the settlement was a fragile thing, maintained by constant vigilance. But 2 weeks later, that peace was shattered not by an invasion fleet, but by a single pristine white shuttle descending from the upper atmosphere. The proximity alarms wailed across the valley. Thane dropped the welding torch he was using on a shield generator and grabbed his plasma rifle. He ran toward the landing field, his heart hammering against his ribs. He arrived to find Kaelira already there. She stood in the center of the dusty clearing, armed with a staff of hardened ironwood. She was flanked by a dozen of her students, teenagers of various species holding training weapons, looking terrified but resolute. The shuttle landed with a soft hiss of repulsor lifts. The ramp lowered. Thane raised his rifle, aiming at the door. A single figure emerged. It was not a soldier. It was a tall Zerethi male wearing the flowing iridescent robes of a high diplomat. He held his empty hands out, palms up, in the universal sign of truce. I come unarmed, the Zerethi called out, his voice amplified by a collar vox. And I come alone. Kaelira did not lower her staff. State your business, envoy, and explain why I should not remove your ship from my sky. The envoy bowed low, a gesture of deep respect. I am Lord Aris. I speak for the reconstituted Council of Zyrith. I seek an audience with the heir. There is no heir here, Kaelira said coldly. Only citizens. Please, Aris said, stepping to the bottom of the ramp. The Empress is fading. The political vacuum has created instability. We do not seek to arrest you, Lady Kaelira. We seek to beg. Thane moved to stand beside Kaelira, his finger hovering over the trigger guard. He felt the tension radiating off her. This was the past coming to reclaim her. Speak, Kaelira commanded. The Empire is fracturing, Aris explained, sweat beading on his pale violet forehead in the humid heat. Vexen's treachery ran deep. Without a strong central figure, the warlords of the Outer Rim are gathering. They smell blood in the water. They do not care about your reforms or the truth about the catalyst. They only care about power. If they strike, they will burn the core worlds. Billions will die. He took a step forward, his eyes pleading. Your mother is too weak to hold them back. The people remember you. They remember you storming the chamber. They remember your strength. If you return, if you take the throne, you can unite the fleets. You can stop the civil war before it begins. Thane watched Kaelira's profile. He saw the conflict war in her eyes. She had been bred for this. The salvation of her people was her genetic imperative. And if I return, Kaelira asked quietly, what of my companion? Aris looked at Thane. There was no disgust in his gaze, only a pragmatic calculation. He would be welcomed. As a consort, we have drafted new laws. The ban on interspecies unions has been lifted. It was necessary to bring you back. It was the perfect offer. Validation, power, legitimacy. She could go back, save her people, and keep the man she loved. She could have it all. Thane lowered his rifle slowly. He didn't speak. He knew this was a choice he could not make for her. If she wanted to go, if the call of the crown was too strong, he would pack his bags and follow her into the snake pit, because that was the deal. Kalira looked at the white ship. It represented clean halls, soft beds, and the adoration of billions. Then she looked at the settlement behind her. She saw the half-built solar array Thane was working on. She saw the refugee children clutching their training sticks. She saw the mud on her boots. She looked at Aris. "No," she said. Aris blinked, stunned. "My lady, perhaps you did not hear me. Billions will die. Billions will always die when people look for a savior to solve their problems," Kalira said, her voice ringing clear across the landing field. "If I return, I become another crutch, another dictator telling them what to do. They need to learn to stand. They need to learn to choose their own leaders, not wait for a bloodline to save them." "But the warlords," Aris protested. "If the warlords attack, then the people must fight them," Kalira said. "And if they need help, let them send a transmission. We will send advisors. We will send technology. We will send grain. But I will not send a queen." She planted her staff in the dirt. "My home is here, my work is here. Go back to the council, Lord Aris. Tell them Kalira Vorn is dead. Tell them there is only Kalira, the teacher." Aris stared at her for a long time. He looked at the resolve in her posture, the way she stood shoulder to shoulder with the human. Slowly, the diplomat nodded. "You have your mother's eyes," Aris said softly, "but your father's heart." He bowed again, turned, and walked back up the ramp. The shuttle hissed, rose on a column of blue fire and shot upward, disappearing into the clouds. Thane let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked at Kalira. "You just turned down a galaxy." Kalira turned to him. She didn't look regretful. She looked light. "I already have a galaxy, Thane. It is just a little smaller and has significantly more mud." She walked past him, heading back toward the village. "Come. The solar array will not fix itself, and I believe you promised to install the heating unit in the clinic before nightfall." 2 months after the envoy's departure, the season changed. The twin suns drifted apart in the sky, bringing the twilight season, where the nights grew longer and the air cooled, smelling of ozone and blooming night orchids. Kalira sat in the medical clinic, a sterile white dome that Thane had meticulously restored. She was sitting on the examination table, her legs dangling. A medical droid, a salvaged unit with a cracked chassis but updated software, hummed as it scanned her abdomen with a beam of blue light. Thane stood by the door, his arms crossed, looking anxious. Kalira had been fatigued lately. She had been snapping at students, sleeping through the morning alarms, and eating strange combinations of ration bars. The droid beeped a cheerful melodic tone. "Analysis complete," the droid chirped. "Subject is in optimal health. Nutrient levels are slightly low in iron. Supplementation is recommended." "And the fatigue?" Kalira asked, frowning. "I am a Zarithi highborn. I do not get tired. Fatigue is a standard metabolic response to gestation," the droid replied. Thane froze. "Gestation?" Kalira went very still. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. "Explain." "You are pregnant," the droid stated simply. "Approximately 9 weeks. The fetus is a hybrid genetic viability. Zarithi maternal DNA. Human paternal DNA. Development is proceeding within expected parameters for a cross-species conception." Silence filled the small room. It was a heavy, stunned silence. Kalira looked at Thane. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of shock and a terrifying, overwhelming awe. "That is impossible," she whispered. "The genetic contracts. The Crown-mandated inhibitors. I was engineered to be sterile until the succession was secured." "The inhibitors were linked to your royal biosignature," Thane said, his voice rough. He walked toward her, his steps tentative. "When Vexen stripped your command codes, when the Council declared you an exile, they disconnected me from the royal grid," Kaelira realized. "The failsafes deactivated." She looked down at her hands, hands that had held swords, signed death warrants and tilled soil. Now, they were cradling a ghost of life. "A hybrid," she murmured. "It was forbidden. They said it would create monsters. They said the DNA was incompatible." "The droid says otherwise," Thane said. He stood between her knees, placing his hands over hers on her stomach. "It is viable." Kaelira looked up at him, tears hot and silver welled in her eyes. "I am going to be a mother." The word felt strange in her mouth, heavy, real. "We are going to be parents," Thane corrected gently. He smiled, and it was a blinding, radiant thing. "We're going to have a little monster with your temper and my stubbornness. The galaxy isn't ready." Kaelira laughed, a wet, broken sound. She leaned forward, burying her face in his chest. "I am terrified. I can fight an army. I can fly a ship through a storm. I do not know how to do this." Thane wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against him. "We figured it out, just like everything else. We improvise." That night, they climbed to the roof of their cabin. It was a flat expanse of wood and fused metal, still warm from the day's suns. They laid out blankets and lay back, watching the sky. The stars here were different from the ones viewed from the deck of a warship. They were not navigation points or strategic targets. They were just lights. Beautiful, distant fires burning in the dark. Kaelira rested her head on Thane's shoulder, her body curled against his side. The revelation of the pregnancy sat between them, not as a burden but as a promise. "Do you see that one?" Kaelira pointed a slender finger at a cluster of blue stars. "The Zarethi navigators call it the hunter's bow, but the locals here call it the cradle." "I like cradle better," Thane said. "Less violence." "I have been thinking," Kaelira said softly, "about the beginning. The gala, the hallway," she corrected, "the shaking ship, the way you looked when you fell." Thane chuckled, the vibration rumbling in his chest. "I looked like a man about to be airlocked." "You looked terrified," she agreed. "But you also looked solid when you bumped into me. It was the first time in years I had felt something that wasn't trying to kill me or flatter me. It was just a collision. Honest physics." She turned her head to look at him, her eyes catching the starlight. A playful, mischievous glint entered her gaze, the same glint she had shown in the cave on the moon. "You know," she teased, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Technically, you remain the only being in the galaxy who has assaulted a royal person and lived to tell the tale. You did touch my butt, eventually." Thane laughed out loud, the sound echoing into the night. He turned on his side, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. She looked radiant, the moonlight softening her features, making her look younger, freer. "I seem to recall," Thane said, grinning, "that you were the one who dragged me to your quarters. You poured me wine. You locked the door. If we are keeping score, Princess, you summoned me first." "I summoned a servant," Kaelira countered, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "I found a king." Thane's smile faded into a look of fierce devotion. He leaned down, kissing her forehead, then her nose, and finally her lips. It was a slow, lingering kiss, filled with the comfort of a shared life. "No kings," Thane whispered against her mouth. "No queens. Just us. Just us," she agreed. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, flat and firm beneath the fabric of her tunic. "And one more," she added. "And one more," Thane echoed. 3 weeks later, the sky filled with ships. It was not an invasion fleet. It was a migration. Thane and Kaelira stood on the highest ridge overlooking the valley. The wind whipped at their clothes and hair. Above them, a massive transport ship, scarred and patched with mismatched hull plating, was descending through the clouds. It bore no imperial markings. Instead, painted on its hull in rough, bright strokes, was the symbol of the new alliance, a hand and a claw, clasped together. It was the Free Horizon, the first of the refugee ships from the core worlds to answer Kaelira's broadcast. "They are here," Thane said, shielding his eyes from the twin suns. "More than I expected," Kaelira said. She adjusted the comm link on her ear. "Landing control. This is Kaelira. Guide them to the eastern plateau. Have the medical teams on standby. They will be hungry and tired." "Copy that. Kaelira," a voice crackled back. "Welcome wagon is ready." The massive ship settled onto the ground with a deep, resonant boom that shook the earth beneath their feet. The cargo bay doors groaned open. Thane watched as the ramp extended. Hundreds of people began to pour out. There were humans in gray rags, Zerithi in torn robes, and other species he didn't even recognize. They stumbled into the light, squinting at the twin suns, looking around at the green valley with expressions of disbelief. They looked broken. They looked exhausted. But they were free. Kaelira watched them, her hand resting on her stomach. She wasn't looking at them as subjects to be ruled. She was looking at them as neighbors. "Do you miss it?" Thane asked quietly. "The flagship, the power?" Kaelira looked at the flagship of her new life, a rusted transport full of desperate souls looking for a second chance. "Power is a command," Kaelira said, her voice strong and sure. "It is static. It is cold." She turned to Thane, her eyes shining with a fierce, overwhelming love. "This," she said, gesturing to the valley, to the people, to him. "This is chosen, and that makes it infinite." Thane smiled. He reached out and took her hand. "Ready to go to work?" he asked. "Always," she said. They walked down the ridge together, hand in hand, moving toward the landing ship to welcome the tired travelers home. Above them, the twin suns began to set, painting the sky in colors of gold and violet, casting long shadows that stretched out ahead of them, not as darkness, but as a path leading toward a tomorrow they would build with their own hands,